One of history's biggest civilizations was the Roman Empire. It created new sciences, medicines, and works of great minds akin to the ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates, Hippocrates, Plato, and Aristotle, to name a few. It also offered us poetry, music, art, and stories. These contributions continue to this day. What we don't consider when we think of ancient Rome is the slavery that made all of this possible. When we think of ancient Rome, we think of the decadence, luxury of a society, and living opulently. The empire's fuel: slavery. Slavery was such a vital component of the Roman Empire's ecosystem that 1 in 5 of its people were slaves, allowing the empire to function on slave labor. It was so widespread that Emperor Nero was once informed by his advisor Seneca that a proposal had been made in the Senate to tell slaves and free men apart by their clothing. However, it soon became clear how serious the danger would be if the slaves should start keeping count of the free men's numbers. In other words, if slaves realized how many there were, they could easily rebel against their owners. But first, how did the Romans ever manage to acquire that many slaves? Slaves were seized in a variety of ways. The majority were foreigners and were either foreign prisoners of war, sailors captured in battle, or citizens of a city or town that had been conquered. Nevertheless, they were also sold by pirates and exchanged in markets. Some sold themselves or were born into slavery to pay off astronomical debts. However, not everyone was held in servitude for all time. A slave might buy their freedom or obtain it from their master if they were older than 30, although it wasn't frequent. A life as a slave. What did slaves do in the Roman Empire? Slaves took part in every aspect of Roman life. They were domestic helpers, laborers, gladiators, prostitutes, and even accomplished artists, bookkeepers, or doctors. Depending on their station, a Roman slave day can look extremely different. So let's examine a typical day in the lives of 4 slaves in ancient Rome. Gladiators. The idea of gladiators originally originated in Rome around 264 BC when Senator Junius Brutus Pyrrha's son had 2 slaves engage in a duel to the death in his honor, starting a long-standing custom in the Roman Empire: gladiator fighting. Some gladiators were slaves who were conscripted into the arenas as retribution for crimes and transported right to the Colosseum to amuse the crowd as they suffered a bloody demise at the hands of lions or leopards, or were eaten by them. If you believe in Hollywood, not all gladiators were slaves. Some were criminals, others were captured enemy troops, and there were even volunteers and men who desired glory in the arena. Each gladiator battle was fought to the death, and if the loser was still standing, their destiny was determined by the referee's thumbs up or down. But not everything is as it appears in the film. As too much time and preparation were invested in the gladiators to simply lose them after one bout, fights were rarely to the death. Slaves bought in marketplaces were selected for their physique and attractiveness, with the intention that they would lead a long and illustrious life as a gladiator. In comparison, the Romans would treat these gladiators like superstars, engraving their names on jewelry and creating pottery in their likeness. They were still at the bottom of the Roman food chain, though, and their lives only lasted as long as their good fortune did. A typical day for a gladiator slave wasn't all that different from any other gladiator. In fact, they lived in relative comfort compared to slaves who were forced to work as hard laborers, but they were still prisoners of war when they weren't fighting in the arena, which they only did about 5 times a year. Gladiator slaves were at least promised 3 meals a day, medical care, and specialized training gear. Despite being confined in a fortress and forced to practice non-stop to succeed in the arenas, the slaves shared a modest room with 1 other person. Some of the better gladiator schools even featured indoor plumbing and heated flooring for winter baths. The unskilled slaves. The lives of slaves who performed manual labor were frequently the harshest. As a kind of punishment, these people were frequently sold into slavery and forced to labor in the fields until they died. They were viewed as being inexpensive and easily replaced, despite living short lives in terrible and brutal conditions. Their abusive masters beat and whipped them to keep them working past their breaking point with no regard for their welfare. They're given a break from their work or a chance to be spiteful, but they're forced to revel in the severity of their predicament under the overseer's strikes, according to an ancient Greek historian named Diodorus Nicholas, who wrote for Nola. These slaves would toil in perilous conditions from sunrise to sunset without breaks, with little food offered at the end of each day. They were frequently branded on the forehead with their master's mark so they could never escape, and they were frequently chained to at least 5 other people at all times, even while they slept. The household slaves. Household slaves might frequently be mistaken for normal staff. They would typically consume the same foods, sleep in the same places, and wear similar clothing. These slaves took care of the house and its residents and occasionally slept close by in case their masters needed anything at night. Usually, weaker women or children who could fetch, carry, and clean for their lords were considered domestic slaves. The slaves' fortunes could change drastically. They might live their lives in a way that isn't all that different from that of a paid domestic servant if they had a good owner, relatively speaking, and they might even be given freedom after their owner's passing. However, if they had a bad owner, they might endure abhorrent treatment. There were no regulations or limitations on what you could do to your property, which included slaves. Evidence indicates that they were frequently the targets of physical and sexual abuse, such as raping, beating, flogging, and branding by their masters. Some extremely vengeful masters would even kill their slaves out of what they thought to be a pleasure. Educated and competent slaves. In the ancient Roman Empire, the most sought-after and expensive slaves were those with special skills. These were well-educated people who frequently held jobs as chefs, secretaries, and accountants. These slaves were some of the most highly prized and frequently came from conquered areas of famous cities like ancient Greece because many occupations required education. A vine dresser, or someone who cultivated grapevines, may cost anywhere between 6,000 and 8,000 sesterces, according to the Roman author Columella. The ordinary Roman foot soldier received roughly 600 sesterces a year after deductions, to put that into context. Due to the exorbitant cost of these slaves, they were frequently purchased by high-ranking members of the Roman elite, such as senators and legislators, or even by the Roman government itself, which used them to build and maintain bathhouses and other significant government institutions. These slaves had somewhat free lives. They might possess property under the master's control, earn a tiny income from it, and utilize it as they pleased. That's it for today's video. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment on what video you want to watch next. And if you've enjoyed this video, then make sure to watch this video to learn more about Ottoman slavery.